Hi everyone, welcome to this JOSM validation training. My name is Amy Mackinnon and I'm a senior at George Washington University. I'm also a member of the Validation Hub team. So this training is going to go over how to validate data in Java OpenStreetMap, which is the primary software we use for verifying OSM data. The training is also going to assume that you already have a good amount of mapping experience under your belt, just because you're going to be reviewing other people's edits, so it's important that you're an intermediate or advanced mapper. And it's also going to assume that you have already some experience mapping in JOSM and are at least familiar with the interface. So it's going to start out just by me explaining what validating is and why it's important, and then we'll go into the actual workflow and start working with JOSM. So these slides I made using the YouthMappers Validation Training document, which I'll link at the end, and also just some of my own personal experience validating and what pop up as the most common issues. So first, just what is validation? The goal is to verify the quality of the data that users input to OpenStreetMap. Obviously, it's an open source platform, so technically anyone can add edits to it, which is why this stuff is really important before the data actually gets uploaded. And we also want to constantly get mappers to keep improving their mapping and give them some tips and just general positive reinforcement to keep using the platform and keep contributing to projects. So there are three overarching goals that we're looking for when we're validating. The first is spatial accuracy, which is just that objects are aligned with the imagery and are in the correct location and are in general just the correct size. There's also tagging accuracy, which is usually just checking that buildings are tagged as buildings and roads are tagged correctly, whether that be primary, secondary, residential, or as trails. And also just completeness, which is self-explanatory, just is everything in the square mapped. A lot of times as validators, we add a couple finishing touches and just add in a couple buildings at the end that mappers may have missed. So this is the workflow that I usually follow. This is just a preview of it and we'll go into it after this, but the first thing to do is always read instructions for the task, as always, even when you are just mapping. Then you're gonna align the correct imagery as outlined in the task, and depending on what the user used to map. Then you'll do just a general overview scan for whether or not the square is complete or if there are any really big errors or if it just doesn't align with the imagery at all. Usually that's not the case, but it's always good to just do a general scan to know what you're working with. Then in JOSM, there's a validation tool, which is really helpful to point out smaller errors that you might not see just with your eye, like squaring buildings or if things are overlapping, things like that. Then once you've gone through that a few times and double checked everything, you'll upload your edits and mark the task as complete. And then one of the most important parts of validation is adding a comment at the end where you mention all the users who worked on it, you thank them, and you can also give them a tip like make sure that you square all of the buildings, or make sure that you don't overlap buildings, make sure that you also map roads, anything that will help them when they're mapping in the future. So now I will share my screen and we can get into the actual process of opening the task in JOSM and go from there. Okay, so now we're on to the first step of the workflow, which is just going over the instructions for the task. So I just picked this random task on hot to do an example for the training, but this is going to be applicable for pretty much any task that you pick, even if it's not on hot. So the three things that I usually look for when I read over the instructions are what imagery to use, what I should map in the task, and also what I should tag the edits as. So it looks like the first thing we see here is to use MaxArt imagery. Hopefully mappers before us also use that because that'll make our job a lot easier if it's all just already aligned. But it looks like it also says that we can adjust the imagery or use other sources if the imagery is bad in the task. Then the next thing we see are instructions for tagging roads. It looks like we have residential here with some examples and tracks. Tagging roads is definitely something to look out for when you're validating because it can be a little bit complicated, as you can see. So a lot of times that's something that we just want to double check that the mapper is tagged it correctly. So it's good to get familiar with these road tag terms. And then on the bottom, we have here that we're going to also map buildings, make sure you square them and you don't overlap them. That's the usual, and then just tag them as general buildings. So once we go over the instructions for the task, we can open a validation task in JOSM. I've already opened it, but usually you just switch the editor to JOSM, and then you can hit start validation. So then it will open in JOSM and look something like this. So the first thing I'm going to do is just load the imagery. The instructions said Maxar, so I will do that first and then see what we have. It looks like we got off a little easy with this task just because it's 2 huge fields and then the buildings on the side. So I'm just going to zoom in and see what we have. It looks like this is mapped with Maxar, so that's a good sign, although some of the imagery is a little bit misaligned here. So that's the second step that I had in the workflow because this does happen a lot. And it's a lot easier to just move the imagery underneath rather than trying to move around each of these individual buildings. So I'm going to go to imagery, new offset, and then this menu will pop up. You can use just the left-hand click or left click and align the imagery behind, that way you don't move all the buildings. So this is just going to make it a little bit easier to look at and do like a general visual scan of, because it's kind of hard to tell if it's misaligned and it just looks really chaotic. So once you have that, you can just hit OK. And you'll see the little icon here, which indicates that you realigned it. So then after I have that, I noticed missing buildings up here when I was looking at it. Looks like there's just a couple though, so usually when you're validating, it's a lot easier to just fix the missing buildings or a couple missing roads yourself rather than sending the task back and marking it as not completely mapped. This is especially the case when the task hasn't been worked on in a while, which you can tell by just looking at the history tab. If it hasn't been edited in a few months or even years, and it's probably not likely that someone's going to come back and fix whatever you marked in your comment, or if you marked it as needing more mapping. So a lot of times it's just easier to go through and make those few fixes yourself. But it's also kind of up to your judgment. If you see a lot is missing and there are people active on the task, then you can easily just send it back and hopefully someone will do that. And then you can just keep validating. But in this case, it looks like it is pretty completely mapped with this imagery. So the next thing we're looking for is just general spatial accuracy. It looks like all the buildings pretty much fit the shape. It looks like here someone mapped a tree. So in this case, we can just delete this edit. But a note on this is that in most cases, you're not going to delete the edits of other users. One major thing that we have in validation is that you want to try to preserve the user's work who have mapped. That way their username is still attached to the edits. So for example, if we go up here and we see maybe a building that isn't completely aligned, but it still looks okay. This is actually fine, but I'll just do it as an example. We can move the edit around, but I'll just do that rather than deleting the building and completely redrawing it, because in that case, then I'll get the credit for the building, but we actually want whoever mapped this initially to still get the credit for it. We're just doing a few minor adjustments to it. So that's a really important part of validation. But again, if you see something like the tree being mapped, then you can just delete that because it's kind of hard to try to adjust that and make it a practical edit. So after we do that scan, we can go to the JOSM validation tool, which is obviously key in the whole process because it'll point out things that are like really tedious errors and you might not be able to just see just from doing an overview of it. In this case, it's actually not too bad, but especially when you have like really crowded and packed in buildings, the validation tool is really, really helpful. So you can get to it just by going to this blue check on the side, and it will open this new tab here that's called Validation Results, and then you can just run the tool. Okay, so I've run the tool, and as you can see, it pops up with this very chaotic looking map layer, which is called Validation Errors. So this highlights everything that pops up as an error with the tool. I think it can look a little bit busy when you're zoomed out because it usually highlights all the roads if they aren't named, which is most roads in a lot of cases. So it makes your screen look a little bit chaotic, but when you zoom in, it's a lot easier to see what the errors are. And then also you can go over to here and see warnings and other, and we'll just expand that and see what we have. So first it has overlapping buildings, which I think is what we're looking at right here. But to actually see what the issue is, you can expand the folder and just right click and zoom to problem. So yeah, it's like we're already zoomed to it. I like to sometimes just turn this layer off once I've already identified the problem, just because it's kind of hard to tell what's going on with the highlight there. But yeah, it looks like here these buildings are overlapping, so it's really good with that the tool highlighted it. So we can very easily just move this away. These nodes are glued together, so we're just going to highlight it, and you can hit G to unglue the node. And then we'll just make sure that we square them. We can delete this node too, since that just got created when it got attached. Now we have the two separate buildings. So we've already fixed one of the 10 warnings. And then this is something important to point out. Like I mentioned earlier, it will highlight any roads that aren't tagged or that aren't named. And in a lot of cases, we aren't going to know the name for the road, so you can just ignore that. Unless you can find it in Google Maps. I'm not going to do that now, but for the most part, you can just ignore those, especially for small little tracks like this. There is probably not a name for it, at least not one that we can find. So for the most part, you can just ignore that, although it will always pop up as a warning. We also see untagged ways, so that's always something to look into. We want to make sure that all the buildings are tagged as buildings and that all the roads are tagged as something. So I'll again right click, zoom to problem, and it looks like we just have a building that isn't mapped as building, so we can just select it. Let me move my screen here, and then hit add, and I already have this building because it's the last thing I tagged, but just do building equals yes and hit OK. Then we fixed that problem. That's another common thing that happens. And then this error says WAN node near other highway. So this usually means that one road isn't connected to another. Yep, there we have it. So all you're going to do for this is click Control, hold it down so that we can highlight both nodes. And then you can click M to merge the nodes. So now the roads are connected. That's a really important thing to do when validating, is to make sure that all of the roads are connected, because that's a common thing that's missing, is that we'll just have a random track mapped in the middle of nowhere and it won't be connected to anything. And that's one of the most important things that we're doing in OSM, is to create road networks so that we know how to get places. So especially something like this where the road is right next to it, but the computer won't recognize it as connecting, it's really, really important that we fix that. So that's another common error to look out for. It looks like we have gone through all those. And then we have some other warnings here. Building with an almost square angle. This is a really helpful tool because obviously it's kind of hard just from looking at it to tell exactly if a building is square or not. Sometimes it can be obvious, but let's zoom to the problem. And also use this to highlight. Looks like it's highlighting this node right here in the blue. So yeah, it's not square. We can just click on it and hit Q to square it, and maybe realign it too. And let's see what else. Oh, it looks like this one isn't square, or it wasn't when we ran the validation, but I think we fixed it. we'll just go through and square all these. This is like a pretty easy step to do. It's really nice that it highlights all those for you. And then the next one we're going to go to is the overlapping areas. I think we already fixed this. Yeah. So it'll still pop up if you don't run the tool again, but we already fixed that. But it's nice that it will warn you twice to make sure you go back and fix it. Or, for example, if you had this farmland overlapping with this building, it would also highlight that because it doesn't want two polygons overlapping. So that's going to be the main process just for using the validation tools. And now that I've gone through that, I can run the tool again and just see if there's anything that I missed. It looks like most of these errors are, again, the unnamed ways, which in this case we can ignore. And the highlight without a reference, we can usually also ignore, and then we have another missing name. So as long as you get those common errors, which are the overlapping buildings and areas, the not square buildings, and the roads, those are probably the three most common things that will pop up. So once we've double checked the validation tool, we can go ahead and turn it off, and then we're just going to upload our edits. Again, it'll pop up with this, but that's okay for now. I'm going to add a comment like validated task, 6 connected buildings, or however much detail you want to add. And then just make sure that you pop in the imagery source. This usually automatically populates, but I want to let people know that I use Maxon. And then we can go ahead and upload changes. Make sure that you do this step or else your edits will be saved, obviously. So yeah, now that we have everything validated, we can go back to the tasking manager. This is what the window will look like when you open it for mapping. And when you're done validating, you can just hit, yes, this task is well mapped. And then the really important part is going over to the history tab and just checking on all the users. I won't type them all in, but usually you just hit the @ This is just myself. You @ each user, and then you can type in a comment. I put some examples in the slides that I shared, but it'll just be something like great work mapping. And then also if you want to put in a tip like for that square, I might say make sure that you don't overlap buildings, or make sure that you square all your buildings, because that way hopefully users will see this and continue mapping, and they won't make those same mistakes in the future with their edits. These are just some more examples of comments that I wanted to include here at the end that you can leave for mappers to thank them and just give them some tips. And then once you have this all typed in, you can just hit submit task and you're done with the validation process. And that'll unlock the square so you can go into another one in the project. So at this point, we've gone through the whole workflow from reading the instructions to the task, to aligning the correct imagery to the task and using the JOSM validation tool to pick out those really small errors. And then we uploaded and we marked it as complete, and of course thanked the mappers at the end. So this is the whole workflow that I usually go through. At the end here I have some resources for more information. Validation Hub documents can be found on the YouthMappers website under projects and then Validation Hub. You can just find more information about validation here and the team. But there's also resources like the training document, which I referenced for this presentation, and some additional tips and plugins that you can use in JOSM to make the validation process go a lot more smoothly and quickly. So I would definitely recommend checking those out once you get more comfortable with validating in JOSM. Thank you for listening to this training. Hopefully you learned a lot and you can get to validating. Thank you.